Buenas tardes.
Good evening. Let's continue with our next panel. We have with us Rolando Cordera, Susana Chacon, Carlos Antonio Heredia Subieta, Federico Novello, and as a moderator, Eduardo Vega. You have the floor. Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. It is our pleasure to be here this evening to have a conversation about a concerning issue. This is an issue that it is a concern not only of economists, but other professions show equally concern. Doesn't matter if we are directly connected with neoliberalism, how did it originate, why is it important to consider a sudden or gradual decline, any of this too, but why is neoliberalism moving downwards? And also, what are the most viable alternatives to consider our immediate future in this framework? And also, if we consider the midterm. And to answer all of those questions, I have the pleasure to moderate this panel in the framework of the Siege Upon Civilization organized by its cultural department. And we're trying to address all the different forms of this siege to civilization, from wall to wall, from the Berlin Wall to the wall that Trump wants to build. And this evening we have a premier panel. I will introduce each one of the members of the panel. I'll give a very brief introduction. Their bios are very long, so I will rather give them more time to speak their minds about this topic. So this evening we have the opportunity to have the views of Rolando Cordera, an emeritus professor from the School of Economics and the coordinator of the University Program for Development Studies. I'll give you more information about Rolando Cordera. We have as well with us, and I'll follow the same order of the panel, we have Carlos Heredia, a graduate from the economics program from ITAM, and also PhD from McGill. Oh, I'm sorry, I said a master's in Spanish, a PhD as well from UNAM, and he's an expert in international politics and also an expert in the matters that we will address today. Then we'll hear from Susana Chacon, who is also an expert in international affairs. She studied sociology, international affairs, economics from different prestigious universities, among which we have CIDE, Harvard, and she is an international consultant in these matters. And we will lastly hear from Federico Novella, also an economist from UNAM and a PhD in economics and international politics. Has written several books, and later on I will make reference to some of them. So in my opinion, we have premier experts in this panel to address the topic. So in order to begin, and before I introduce Rolando Cordera, I would like to say that he is an expert and he's been very busy as a researcher, and has followed closely all the developments of our Mexican economy and society, but he has studied the international climate. I'm just going to mention a few books of his. A book that it is The Dispute of the Nation, which is an obliged reference, and himself and Carlos Tello debate over the fact that if Mexico by the end of the 70s and the 80s should have been driven to the neoliberal model, or instead a model more concerned for a more inclusive domestic development. And recently, he has also written The State and the Crisis, The Welfare State and Global Crisis, and later on, Beyond Crisis. And this year, he published from FCE, Perennial Inequalities, and that is, of course, another topic that we will address this evening as a systematic concern. Please, Rolando.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I want to thank the organizers for this very interesting gathering, for inviting me to participate on neoliberalism and its crisis, understood as a model. The first I want to say is that on the table and in archives, we already have sufficient information and argumentation in the sense of the fact that the so-called neoliberal model does not produce stability at the macroeconomic and financial level it claims and defends, nor does it result in economic growth of societies and their respective demographies, everything those two require. What it tends to produce, what this type of economic regimen tends to produce, is a lot of concentration of income and wealth. And with its by policies, especially social policies, a lot of disprotection, particularly on the most vulnerable groups. That's why, in the face of this economic crisis derived from the Great Recession that started as a financial crisis at great proportions 2008, 2009, there are those who say that this formula, this model, if we want to use the word model, it gives way to economic financial crisis, and it doesn't bring with itself the minimum necessary mechanisms to get out of that crisis, and that maintaining this vision, this form of understanding the world, particularly the economy, cannot but make circumstances even worse, circumstances that originally started or caused this situation. This is the situation of Europe, and it continues living this situation, although there are national economies that have already defended themselves a little bit from the attacks of the financial crisis and the economic crisis after that. Or there are also economies that have just started timidly, but in a more or less sustained fashion, to have some type of economic recovery, as it seems to be happening right now in Spain. It's no accident, no coincidence, and this is something that travelers tell us, and the press also talks about this every day. It shouldn't be a surprise to us that some of the elites in the political power and the elites of wealth and the financial institutions internationally that were created allegedly to avoid that catastrophe of the 30s called the Great Depression to be repeated. And openly, people are voicing their position against inequality, against fundamentalism as well, doctrinary fundamentalism. And as President Barack Obama did when he was in power, more or less hand in hand with the Federal Reserve of the United States, well, they've put into practice, not generalized, unfortunately, they have put into practice anti-cyclic policies against recession and for recovery that remind us of the counsel, of the recommendation, the advice, and even the theoretical formulations. Federico, I'm sure, will correct me if I'm wrong, inherited to us by John Maynard Keynes, who lived intensely and in terrible anxiety the Great Depression of the 30s. So then, there is a crisis, and we can even say that this crisis was to a great extent created, produced by the empire because of a way of understanding the state, the political, economics, the society, and the market itself. This is what we call the neoliberal formula that really enthralls the great market, as Mrs. Thatcher said at her moment in power. The only way to regulate the market economies and maintain freedom and liberty. There's no alternative to that. That's why she is celebrated and she is so known. There is no alternative. That was her phrase. She's known for that. We can say all these things. However, what I think we cannot say so easily is that the neoliberal formula is also going through a crisis and right at the brink of being thrown out of the stage or scenario. There's a very important book of a political scientist from the UK called, and this is quite ironic, The Strange Non-Death of Neoliberalism. We all talk about the death of neoliberalism, but the truth is that once you just turn the corner, you find that neoliberalism is standing right there. That's why I wanted to say, to start my conversation, that opposite to what many of the organizers of this interesting gathering told us, in the sense that this panel was the one on economics, when we talk about neoliberalism and its possible or real crisis, and especially if we want to think about alternatives for neoliberalism, then we have to talk about the economy, but we above all have to talk about politics and culture. We have to talk about power, power in the state and power in society, and culture, practically top, bottom, bottom up from one side to the other, of communities where what was imposed gradually, and this is not the result of a manipulation plan of the minds, although there must have been one. This was being imposed for other reasons, the imposition of exacerbated individualism. This is the type of culture that was imposed of progressive disregard or ignorance on the importance of the state. And this has ended up in this year's in our country. This is an exemplary case in point of anomia, a negation, a denial of the standard of the norm almost in a generalized way, as shown at least at the rhetorical discourse level by the claims made by the extreme alternative right in Germany, France, this alternative extreme right in the UK, and Trump in the US, and the way we live this every day at a different level. But at the end, the confluence is the same. That is the criminality and the excess of violence the recourse to weapons, arms of all types to solve once and for all interpersonal, intercommunity litigations. And the only things this speaks about is that, as the classics that we used to read in the 30s, as they used to say, Freud to start with, but Stefan Zweig, for instance, there is a profound malaise in our culture. And in the Mexican case, there's this malaise, not only in democracy, as the UNDP told us at the beginning of the century, but we're starting to see, as shown, for instance, by the most recent survey of the Latin Barometer, this malaise vis-a-vis democracy, a disdain of democracy that has always signified not only freedom to vote and going to the voting places. Democracy has always signified a type of order. And I believe that what we are witnessing and living right now, and a lot suffering as well, as the negation, the denial of this type of order, that is, therein lies this numerous, nefarious character. And I think I will stop at that. Yes, thank you very much. Now, Rolando reminds us of things that, although some or we all know, this gives us a context to continue this conversation, because we can be reminded that in 1981 at the UK, Margaret Thatcher took over, and the same year Reagan in the US, 1983. Kohl in Germany, Helmut Kohl in 74 and 76, the Nobel Economics Prize winner. The prize was given to Hayek and Friedman, respectively. That is, there is a ascent, there is a increase of neoliberalism, and rationality of the marketplace is set at the forefront, and they are decisively betting on individualization of consciences and public decisions, where the state has to withdraw. Well, this neoliberalism is exactly what we've had more or less 40 years been having in Mexico, 3.5 decades in Mexico, where we have had financial liberalization, financial economic privatization, and many other things, where the main concern of this economic politics are not in terms of economic social development, and we're more concerned decisively by fiscal adjustments and preoccupied by the fiscal crisis of the state. This is what they call it. And then the decrease of productive and the downsizing of the productive plant and the apparatus, and the definition of stabilization programs, where inflation becomes a central concern and not development. So all this cultural baggage, Carlos, that it's intertwined with society concerns, people that are still suffering unemployment, subemployment, social inequality, and the states that are neglecting this. It's not their concern, and they are giving preeminence to market decisions. This is the context, and this is why we're meeting here this afternoon. Now, what would be your reflection, your initial reflection on this for this conversation?
Thank you, Eduardo. Thank you very much for University, the National Autonomous University, and the University of Guadalajara for this invitation. I teach at CIDE, but for some decades, I've worked with Mexican and Central American communities in the U.S. And the invitation that Eduardo Vega sent me to talk about culture, it's very important for the message that I want to communicate. The wall that Trump wants to build, that obviously is not going to be built as he wants it to be, as long and wide. So it runs from Matamoros to Brownsville. But a great deal of the land used to be part of the New Spain and used to be Mexican. up to 1848. And this population in California, part of Nevada, part of Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, Texas, and a smaller part of Arkansas. Well, they decided we're not going to cross the border. Talking about walls, the border crossed us. So we are bearing witness that Trump is saying the true Americans are white, Protestant Anglo-Saxons. And if you start tweeting at 4 a.m., well, you feel your sweat on the back of your back. You start seeing the demographics. And you realize that in 2043, the white population, non-Hispanics of course, will stop being the absolute majority in the U.S. And the Hispanic population that in 1970 was 4.7 of the total population in the U.S., it is 18%. In the year 2040, it's going to be 25%, and in 2070 will be around 1/3 of the total population of the U.S. Today, Texas and California have a higher population of Hispanics than non-Hispanics. New Mexico for several years, and that is happening gradually in southeastern states. And that makes Trump followers very wary because they do not consider themselves to be true Americans. The true Americans are those that match with the stereotype that they created all whites, all British, Anglo-Saxons, English speaking, and Afro-Americans were never citizens. You know that in the original document of the Constitution of the U.S., and I'm going to see it, a black was worth 3/5 as a white was worth. Mexicans are not full individuals. Mexicans are not dignified enough to assimilate themselves in this hegemonic nation. And the crisis that we are seeing with Trump makes reference to the fact that a brown-skinned, Catholic, Spanish-speaking population that is completely disconnected from the Protestant Anglo-Saxon community is not part of the definition of an American citizen. However, there is a very important factor. Which we see a clash with Mexican elites. Mexican elites are considered to be seen as whites in Mexico and whites in the U.S. To their surprise, when they get to the U.S. right now, with Trump, they said, well, you're not white. You're not white even if you are blonde, if you are blue-eyed, you are not a white, you are Hispanic. And you will never be part of this elite in the United States. It doesn't matter if you're an MIT professor, it doesn't matter if you have $1 billion. Doesn't matter, you're not going to be a full-fledged citizen. So that cultural understanding grows deeper with the arrival of Trump. It is not that it happened during his administration. It was there already, but it exacerbates and reaches the situation, which sometimes it's valid to ask the same questions to other people, not necessarily Mexicans, what we are experiencing today. And I read a text by a Colombian writer, Sergio Campo Madrid, the time of Bogota, And it specifies in his book, and it says Mexico is not North America, semicolon, as it was believed, semicolon, but it does not feel like one of our own. So Trump is telling Mexico, you are not North America. You racially are not North American. You are not North America. You are not North America economically. You are not North America linguistically. And to our elites, that creates a shock. They're not going to overcome this shock in a while. The denouncement of NAFTA, that in the facts, this is what Trump is doing. I don't know if this is going to become formal, but it's happening. I don't want an agreement with Mexicans. What part of my negation you don't understand? So that statement rubs Mexican elites the wrong way. And they said, well, I studied at MIT, I studied at Harvard, I have my own business, I made investments. Okay, come on. You will never be my equal. You will never be our equal. So, and I'm going back to Rolando's words, and that is that in NAFTA's political economy, Mexican elites, well, they are unaware of this neoliberal crisis. So we see surreal scenes where U.S. trade unionists and from Canada as well, they said we cannot negotiate, so we cannot renegotiate NAFTA with this petty wages that you pay in Mexico, and our elites react like this. Okay, so you're not going to come and teach us how to treat our workers. We know how to treat our own workers, so you don't. Listen, there is a strike. No, there are no strikes. They see thousands of workers on the streets, so why are you complaining about? So, this complete sense of surrealism is that Mexican elites are being told, no, you are okay, so don't come and make noise about this. So, who's next doors during NAFTA negotiations that speaks for the workers, about the workers? No one is speaking on behalf of Mexican workers. So, we have automobile plants, these are highly qualified workers, in which there is a union, there is a collective bargaining agreement, there's everything, but no process of workers. And they are hired, and before they even exist, they are hired. So this actually creates indignation. So this can't be that we're living in such a situation where the Mexican government implements what we described along with Carlos Castañeda, the patriotic exploitation. So we have the right to exploit Mexican workers because we know how to do it, and they will put up with it. Don't worry, we will take care of them. And I'm saying this as awful as it sounds because the reality is as awful as this. In the United States, what is actually happening with this neoliberal model crisis is that the social covenant that the Americans made after World War II included three basic premises. We're going to be the largest economy in the world. We're going to be the largest military power that the world has ever seen. And we're going to have an expanding middle class. So your grandchildren will live better than your parents and better than your grandparents. And that's over, of course. They are, of course, globally a large power. They, of course, are the largest military power, but they don't have an expanding middle class. And the crisis derives from the fact that before we had between the poor Americans more than the figures that we have in our minds. People living under the poverty line, they were Latino immigrants or unemployed people. No, we have white people with a job and they are poor. That kind of population in employment or poor, this is the population that rejected Hillary Clinton's discourse and took the Donald Trump's rhetoric. It's not Donald Trump's policies because Donald Trump and his own rhetoric, well, he used a populistic rhetoric in the American context. Nobel is going to say that I'm wrong. I know that. But they rule as oligarchs, as we see in the Mexican government. So the crisis is right there, is reaching a point where in industrialized countries in the U.S., well, they cannot earn a decent living with their job. And in a country like Mexico, of course, the same applies, considering the fact that there is a deliberate punishment to the wages. Norma Samaniego made an excellent presentation in a seminar that we organized along with Rolando in terms of how the wages have dropped in Mexico and the proportion of the national income given to labor has declined, and how the owners of technology and the owners of the know-how is increasing, not wages. And let me wrap up with another reflection that takes us to the South. The same journalist who wrote Mexico is not North America as it used to believe writes 3 paragraphs below, one day Mexico will have someone explaining the world what happened with the thousands of Central American migrants that ended up in a mass grave. I am from Tamaulipas. When we had the San Fernando massacre for the first time, it was a shock. But in my state, people, well, we knew that this happened and no one said a word about it. The buses that ran from here to Matamoros or Reynosa, well, you only got suitcases. At the bus station at Reynosa, you would had buses with suitcases. And what about the owners of the suitcases? Well, they were not on the bus. How come? Well, they were taken down from the bus. Who did that? Well, the Zetas drug gang. This journalist writes as well, one day Mexico will have to explain the world. And the biggest disgrace is that as we're discussing the wall, the Mexican section says to the U.S., you can say that the wall is against Central Americans. It's not against Mexicans. You can say that. Those are the ones who are part of the problem. We're not the problem, and that's how they explain the situation. Mexican migration has gone down. Now, it's about Central Americans. You can describe it in such terms. It's to stop Central Americans. Well, we need to save face. How can Mexico save face if we are to prevent this attack of Trump's wall when we have built our own walls? Of course, economic, racial, geographical. It doesn't matter how many hues of skin we have in Mexico. We have built the same number of walls. We have a tremendous wall in the Suchiate River and in the Tehuantepec Isthmus. Why? Because the Homeland Department defined something that goes against the textbooks from 5th grade, that the border between the U.S. and Mexico ran from Tijuana, San Diego, and Matamoros, Brownsville. But it doesn't work that way. The border between Mexico yes, between Mexico and the U.S., is the Suchiate River. And if this is where Mesoamerica ends, or the Panama Canal. So this externalization of the border is the siege under the Mesoamerican civilization is. Elites have interiorized that. Oh yeah, it's not against us, it's against Central Americans. Very well, so Carlos has set the ground just as it happens, and you remind me of the neoliberal expression, free movement of goods, freedom of movement of capital, freedom of movement of individuals. That's something that we will have to see. And there is a social, economic, and political and racial restriction in what you've mentioned. I would say, Susana, in order to continue with this conversation, we have questions about neoliberalism. There is a question, is it undergoing a crisis or not? Should we consider an alternative? Should we consider a potential change? Can we take social cohesion and development to make it work? Many authors have written about it. I'm only going to mention a few. If this neoliberal phase that is tagged along with globalization of markets, Stiglitz, for example, in one of his titles, Discomfort and Globalization, another one, The Price of Inequality, Strecht, a German that I'm very grateful towards Rolando because you make me learn about this book, The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. But Bourguignon from France says the globalization of inequality. So there are many economists, many sociologists, experts in different disciplines that talk about serious problems of neoliberalism with globalization. And Roderick uses his paradoxes and the elements of globalization, sovereignty, globalization, and democratic decisions inside the societies that are organized this way. So there are many, many problems. And from other perspectives and disciplines, what is your opinion? What is your opinion about the neoliberal crisis and the crisis of globalization?
Thank you so much, Eduardo. First of all, let me thank UNAM and the book fair in Guadalajara, the university, State University of Arizona, for this possibility and invitation to be here, colleagues, friends, at this panel to be able to debate. But I also thank you for organizing this. This is undoubtedly very complex to have an event like the one we're having here today. In this space, let me share with you a few reflections. And I'm really very happy that Rolando and Carlos have started with positions different from mine, because this will allow for a combination, but also a very comprehensive outlook. The crisis of the neoliberal model and the new economic order. This is the title of our panel here today. And as we have seen, this is not necessarily seen exclusively from the economic viewpoint. I wanted to say something that frames this within a broader perspective, a perspective in which we is going through a multidimensional crisis that our society is facing, given the result of the evolution in what has been almost a very fast change of values in democratic institutions, as Eduardo rightly said, and the economic globalization, especially intercultural relations, not only in the U.S. but globally. That, of course, this has started since the end of the Cold War. It seems that we lost a direction we had, and the traditional values are blocked in terms of classic traditional neoliberalism after all these moments. and this is completely set aside, and we lose direction. And in 1997, a thinker, Sagaria, concluded in a very important article we discussed then the search of liberal democracy. He said the political process fell into a trap, which is anachronic, of course, saying that Woodrow Wilson took the United States to the 20th century exactly with the challenge of creating a safe world for democracy. And as we got closer to the new century, 97, he said, well, our task is to make democracy safe for the world as we see it right now. Really, this is not an answer. And we are within a very dramatic change towards nationalisms and towards a form that has gained ground in many countries that were supposed to be democratic. We see many autocratic regimes, and what's endangered now is what we knew as the traditional international order of the last 25 years, of the last quarter of century. Originally, roots were gestated at the principles of neoliberalism and multilateralism, but it seems that today the world is rather, as Rolando rightly said, is going through individual power structure. And on the other hand, nations are seeking extremely narrow interest in which we see that there are no restrictions that are significant, that they're not even considering any space for the element of world peace. And of course, prosperity is set aside. And why do they talk about sustainability? How can we have sustainability at the individual level or perspective? And leaders who are really exclusively there because of their very narrow interests. If we take into account studies like the Freedom House study of last year, 2016, it is very interesting to see that we are in the 11th a consecutive year in which we see a decline of what we knew as global freedom. This means that we are globally at the local level facing a very dangerous trend, which is not an accidental phenomenon. The fact that we have a Maduro in Venezuela, the fact that in Catalonia we have once more the element of the independence movement, and in the U.S. the movements that we have beyond the Latino movement, this is no accident. This is a very dangerous trend which is moving forward. It's existed now for the last 11 years. The world is going through a change of what we knew as the old model, where we had a fight between the left and the right, or the dichotomy between liberals and conservatives. And we are going now to a world of nationalisms against globalization. And the nationalist challenges vis-a-vis the globalist model, let us say that they are moving their directions. They have changed, and they have a lot of supporters in the U.S., the U.K., and other places of Europe, and of course in other parts of the world. And the surge of nationalisms, well, this is a characteristic which is increasingly visible. It seems that globalization sits at the defensive. It does not know how to respond. And the xenophobic movements come from democracies, and this, of course, is nurturing the fact that this is we're seeing systemic crises that are even deeper and more profound, as we were saying a minute ago, and the institutions, the economic institutions of the autocratic regimes, and of course nationalisms use this to strengthen their power. They use all the circumstances and they create a very dangerous and hazardous, unstable and uncertain world. We don't really know where we're at, which are the new things we should use to think about different models. In fact, the challenge against the AI liberal democracy is going through an expiation or of non-democratic liberalism, and of course, this is comes since the end of the Cold War. At that moment, democracies they were ornamental democracies, and they became the instrument to optimize exclusively economic neoliberalism. Here we have a circumstance in which right now we see it, and this is that this is like the standard. This is the element of post-democracy. It has become a standard of contemporary political activity, as rightly said by some intellectuals like Wendy Brown of the University of California, in which they say that the current democracy is just a mirage, just to legitimate investment. And as the main democracies, including the U.S. democracy, are questioning the icon of one of their main elements, which was free elections. This is just it's a circus of marketing to have more funding, more resources at the economic level for the show of manipulation or for spectacle that is seeking to mobilize voters towards certain specific determined economic interests and groups. The current threat of democracy is a consequence of the lack of philosophical foundation to traditional economic values, political values. And we've discarded completely this, and it seems that those values are playing no game whatsoever. The different manifestations, substantial manifestations, are completely far away from what we know as international regulations. We see, for instance, the surge of a global casino, of this stock exchange games, brokerage games, and the consequence that we have because of the 2009 crisis or liberalization of multilateral corporations that are completely far from any type of national governance. And of course, and this is something we clearly see in our states, the dismantling of the state, which is is this causing levels of unemployment and inequality at the global level, unprecedented levels. We see it not only in the so-called developed countries, but also the not developing countries, but also industrialized and first world countries. I think the principles of democratic governance at the national level as well as worldwide are weakening, and this will evidently results in a backward movement, a regression in international cooperation, but cooperation generally at the global level, also a regression in terms of human rights. And if we see what happened in Tampico, people are getting killed and no one says a thing. Well, and of course, a lot of regression or backward movement in terms of equality and equity. And this, of course, has to do with nationalisms and assertive populisms. The economy and politics should be concerned about the distribution and control of power in society, but rather what is happening right now is a fight for power, a struggle for the lack of will to go back to the path of values that marked the development of society in the world the beginning of last century. So we're completely alien from all that. The last border in the global markets has been dominated by the absence of international regulations. As mentioned a few minutes ago, the fight to be able to express this in different manners, we see it in the increased concentration of the power of the markets and, of course, wealth concentration and the surge of oligarchies, plutocracies, corruption, and also the capture of the state by those powers. So there's a divorce between the economy and politics, and this divorce has resulted in a divorce between governance, human well-being per se, and sustainable development. I believe, therefore, that we cannot talk about the economy, as we were saying a minute ago, without creating a balance, making analytical, critical balance of the different elements. The five principal ones that I see here: the search of a liberal democracy, the regression of cooperation, international solidarity because of the surge of nationalisms, the surge or the existence of neoliberalism in democracy. We would have to ask if this is the model we should follow. And also the progressive evolution of the distribution of social power. And lastly, which are the effective strategies to transform crisis into new paradigms and new development models? within this group that you have, we've posed various solutions for these situations or possible proposals. So then, within the framework, I'm in the Rome Club for 45 years now. We have discussions on the limits of growth. And since then, we've been concluded in the Club of Rome what are going to be the results of global warming, the crisis of hunger, the energy crisis, and also the water crisis in which we're immersed, and the stratospheric levels of consumption, and also wrong habits of our everyday life. I would say that the big corporations and big economic transnational interests have set out to atomize the Club of Rome proposals because the increase in their need to have power depended on getting away from values and the negation, the denial of ethical reasons within and among societies themselves. And well, here we see that the only thing we're looking for is that the sum of the economic political elites are increasingly far away from society that do not allow for answers to be able to address and solve all these problems of inequality, of poverty. More than ever before, this is something that's in effect different, unlike 40 years ago. Just like 40 years ago, today we have many organizations that are talking about these global challenges, economic, political, social challenges, but at the same time, their scope is very limited because we're well defined by economic interests that are the strongest ones, that at the same time they're controlling political interests. We live in a world in which there's no real walls vis-a-vis global problems. When we see, for instance, climate change issues, when we look at the very big problem of drug addiction and weapons trafficking, smuggling, trafficking of human beings, and even narco trafficking, well, the solutions cannot be with walls. I mean, the solution have to do with global collective solutions at the international, national, local levels. Nonetheless, the response of the elite is to build walls, Israel, Palestine, South Africa, Mozambique, or Mexico and the U.S., wherever. Well, as well mentioned by Chomsky at the opening of this cycle, well, Trump is a reflection, he's a phenomenon, but he reflects what is happening in society. A big sector of society at the global level, I'm not just limiting myself to the U.S., it has enough reasons, quite valid reasons, to be quite frustrated and angry with fear and very disappointed and disillusioned because this is the elite that's completely rooted at the institutional level. That's what is happening. Let me go back to nationalisms, these autocratic regimes and populisms. To a certain degree, they lead to the search or research of new fascisms that are threatening our societies. And if we continue denying the fact that the liberal democracies have become basically in their opposite, the contrary of what they wanted to be in terms of the masses that have no democratic spirit and values, well, the change of path of all these proposals we're trying to propose basically is increasingly more distant. Let me highlight something that Roosevelt said in 1933. The only thing we should be afraid of is fear itself. And of course, democracies dominated by fear can fall into false promises of fascist ideologies and autocratic leaders. What better example than the election that just took place in the United States? To a certain degree, to be able to combat this problem, it's been said that the sense of crisis, economic insecurity, and the threats of war or terror are the declared causes of an environment, a climate of fear. And the main reason for which fascism can go back to democracies, to mass democracy, is ignorance. It's still very true that someone who doesn't learn from history is condemned to repeat it. And we continue working with schemes in which the past is catching up with us, and we have leaders that are totally, once more, authoritarian, who are completely away from society. Let us just look at the fiscal reform in the U.S. to see how many benefits society is really getting out of this fiscal reform. What are they getting out of all this? Just to conclude my presentation, let me read a reference of Alexis Tocqueville, 1631, which is quite a current and preoccupying thing. 1831, rather. If I imagine the new features of despotism and how would this been stored in the world, I see an immense multitude of men that are similar without privileges to differentiate them, turning around looking for small and vulgar pressures with which they contemplate their own soul, but without moving from where they're standing, each one far away from the others. They're alien from the fate of the others. And this type of men, we see a tutorial power, immense power that is hovering over their shoulders and without even surveilling over their own fate. This is the question. Is it possible if the people are rejoicing for this? People are not just thinking except for their rejoicing themselves. I've always thought this servitude of silent multitude, the one that I have just described, can be easily combined easier than one could imagine with outside forces of freedom, and that they can be established under the wings of popular sovereignty from wall to wall. So this is the siege on civilization. Thank you, Susana.
Federico. Federico, so the rise of neoliberalism. Let's say that some processes could be described as it strengthened the way against something else. In my opinion, neoliberalism faces with success, either we like it or not, the economic order of the second post-war period. And that economic order, after the accumulation of richness were exhausted and the construction of relatively strong states and institutionally designed to include the growth, the fruits of growth for the population, they were inspired in Keynesian policies. You have written Keynes' invitation from Keynes to Keynes and Mexican foreign policy in the area of globalization. In your opinion, what is the link now that we are describing the discomforts of globalization and the discomfort of liberalism? Thank you, Eduardo. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for this invitation. I believe that this is a very timely colloquium. Therefore, the importance of it cannot be exaggerated. According to historians of neoliberalism, the possibility to disrupt and to shake the consciousness of universities, and I have to bring it up here, when next year it will turn 50 years of the students' movement in 1968. And in alignment with other students' movements back in the 60s, as Hayek said, neoliberals and students, we were against the state. So that's Hayek's statement to begin this discussion. The state has tampered with the economy and has implemented regulations. The size of the state has always been relevant, but the most important problem was the powers of the state. I have to be very honest. I am not going to correct what Rolando said about Keynes' contributions, and I'm not going to prove Carlos wrong about the implications of populism that had changed between contexts. But that's your standpoint. I say, well, but we should say that neoliberalism is not a model, is a program, and that provides it a great skill to adapt It is not an abstract figure. It is a very pragmatic entity that self-corrects very often and that also has this capability of adapting to circumstances that, in my opinion, do not reflect the U.S. reality. I would like to frame the question differently. I believe that if the economy can be global, Trump is a good example. Maduro is a very bad example. But both of them can show that politics happen at a domestic level. And what Trump is doing in order to describe this deterioration, that I agree with Carlos in the sense that, yes, there is somehow political profitability in terms of how Mexico has been mistreated. Well, it's being considered in an electoral process that would come to an end in 2020, where re-election is very appealing and it coincides with the logic of serving the interests of the voters, regardless of the fact if economists, sociologists, and politologists come to agree or not. NAFTA and the changes that Trump proposes, specifically improving the position in which U.S. provides input and added value, 85%, and the rules of origin would be changed in the NAFTA industry, which is the automobile industry. Well, we can picture the most expensive cars in the automobile history. Impossible to export them, but very useful in terms of canceling one of the freedoms that Eduardo mentioned, but it's not going to be as visible or not if NAFTA survives or not. The freedom of investment. Trump doesn't want that U.S. investment multinationals that in that case would have more income and more capacity of managing their business larger than some nations. This multinational companies that give the shape to NAFTA, let's say intra-industry business, intra-firm business, in that case, the deficit would be U.S. and the surplus on the Mexican side. Ford buys Ford, Chrysler buys from Chrysler, GM buys from GM, and the surplus is in the stock exchange of multinational companies that have earn the income generated by neoliberalism and globalization and have made profit from regional integrations as used to have an opaque space for themselves and very promising in the Trans-Pacific Partnership that Trump gave an end to and that Mexico wants to continue with some Asian countries. And it was Obama's strategy to isolate China because China doesn't need any FTAs to be the top global exporter. Now, since the Lippmann Colloquium in 1938, 2 days after when Keynes' general theory was published, they decide to use the term neoliberal. Interestingly enough, there was another option, left-wing liberalism, and then we see that the Mont Pelerin Society moves on and with very specific ways to promote a theology speech favoring the market that I would like to add to what my colleagues had said in this regard in terms of the extraordinary burden of an ideology. Han Yu Chang describes it, the securitization, as the autonomy, the complete autonomy of the nominal world vis-a-vis the productive world, and that creates the best paying jobs, it attracts the best university students, and it brings professional ethics bar to the lowest position. They create derivatives that they affect the consumers because their rights are equal to nil, and the deregulation since the moment the Glass-Steagall disappeared, and and investment banks come together with saving banks in order to promote speculation. Well, these are, of course, core issues in this disgrace. What I believe we need to make a difference in is what capitalism generates per se. Let's say all of what we know about global warming. Of course, it's not a figment of neoliberalism. It's not a long story that now it describes the fact as emissions being reduced, but the concentration of CO2 increases. And it affects all of us. When Brodel tries to explain the importance that the Ottoman Empire holds in the dawning of Europe in the 16th century, he says that the Ottoman Empire should not be taken as a giant in its dying bed. Brodel puts it as a weary giant, and the level of scientific contributions, intellectual contributions, cultural contributions from the East, well, cannot be challenged in order to have the world functioning, specifically for the benefit of the West that eventually becomes the hegemonic power. Neoliberalism is not in a crisis, has set the world in a crisis. It creates crisis, and from that drive, that Dutch drive for tulips in the 17th century until the Great Recession in the summer of 2007, this long list of crises that Kindlebrag compiles, well, makes us think the issue differently out from the 11 crises that he considers to be the most important ones from the 17th century up to the Great Recession. 7 are after 1970. So this is key in terms of describing how vulnerable the economic system is, how the hopes for the future got canceled, what Juan Cruz calls the present time movement. There are philosophers that say that the problem in time is acceleration. Juan Cruz says no, being right here, specifically for young people, they don't have any will of going back to the wisdom of the past, and there's no reason to trust and to hope into the future. So the present is what matters, and that makes us have so scattered minds, as Nicholas Carrin describes to be the upshot of the internet, and that is why we can't focus in terms of have a capital F as the description of the online reader. Horizontal in its actions, but absolutely linear when it comes to the end. That is to say, there's no possibility to focus, and for Mexico, it has enormous complications. Let's say when Ramos, the anthropologist, dooms us to be replicators for not having an original culture, but to have an offshoot of another culture, he announces what we're living right now. This idea, Samuel Ramos describes that in the 19th century, we didn't have a space for ease. If we had the other reading of the Mexican Constitution that Alexis de Tocqueville does, that this idea that Mexico had to take the content of the U.S. Constitution, but not the spirit that gave life to it, and the U.S. has in its spirit, in its mores, in its national feelings, has the conditions to make the Constitution the best written and the most functional one in the world. Alexis de Tocqueville says that Mexico moves from anarchy to the military quartels and from military quartels to anarchy. So that was what our independence creates, and Samuel Ramos puts it like this. We imitate a culture. We were unable to create it. And our problem has been to adapt that original replication of a culture. And this is what we see in how the elites behave in our idea. that in Carlos' list we could add this one too, that we break relationships with North Korea, and Mr. Trump has not mentioned us in that efforts, and he mentions others when we are being used for the short term, when our foreign minister, who is still learning and charging the same wage as if he was an expert, he travels around making FTAs with the country that wants to leave the EU, and a country like Russia that it's a little bit over the Mexican GDP. So a free trade agreement with whomever agrees to in the golden ages of Dr. Cedillo and Mr. Salinas, former presidents of Mexico, but to have experts going to one single country. This circumstance presents situations that are very relevant right now. So the most important thing is that have not analyzed the ideology in which neoliberalism is based. Trump is an accident, as the Aztecs tried to explain time as the Earth and the Sun clashing, because there was no coordination at a certain point in time. But this is not the most fundamental problem, what we have lost sight of. And remember, when the UN analyzes the parallel between doctrine and decisions in multilateral organizations, Mexican foreign policy's doctrine became exemplary. Decisions were related to doctrine. Today we have an enormous pragmatism, neglection of our foreign policy. It's a neglect, and we are not using the definition of what we would understand as our national interest. Trump's interest is that he has fabricated a national interest that is shared in his rhetoric, and it is shared in the votes of these two recent accidents. And they are not solving the problem for the Democrats. And there is another thing that I would like to add, and I know that I'm being provocative. Let's take ownership of this for a while. How Democrats have managed the neoliberal agenda. This crisis of the social democracy is related to the implications of it in the sense that it has neglected the Keynesian approach, and also how the welfare state has been created. The social market in Europe, for example, based on the 2010 agenda presented by Red Agenda, making labor more precarious in order to get jobs in which you need to have many jobs in order to earn a decent living, as using UN's terminology. Now, nationalizing that type of neoliberalism in Mexico, we have formal labor being poor. You can be poor having a formal job, and this idea that this is the administration of employment, this is the administration of poor employment, of poor wages, that kind of employment that you need several jobs in order to buy basic staples. This breaks with the constitutional description of minimum wage, when the minimum wage by hour compared with the U.S., and that's the biggest claim. Who defends Mexican workers? Well, Trudeau came here to defend Mexican workers here. Not the mummies of the CTM trade unions. Trudeau came here to say Mexico has to take care of labor rights, specifically wages, if Mexico wants to uphold this relationship. Now, the NAFTA announcement is a formality that it's being postponed, but the U.S. has not taken from the negotiation table any of its proposal, and Canada, its ally. Now, we have to standardize wages, that it's not a topic for Mexican representatives, but it's not possible, plain and simply, but to turn our eyes to the idea of having better wages in real terms in the long term. That is something that should happen if we want to continue with this type of relationship with other countries. And I would like to wrap up by saying that the problem that we face is the de facto powers playing politics. There's old agreements where the Mexican bourgeoisie didn't step into policies, but they did make business when the PRI was taking care of stability. Well, that has moved to the idea of, yes, having their own governments. And I'm going to use Roosevelt, not from 1933, but 1936, when he already had the experience of the reactions of these elites vis-a-vis the New Deal, where he said, now we know that an organized capital government is as dangerous, and take good care what I'm going to say, as dangerous as an organized crime-based government. Thank you.
Yeah, very kind of you. Thank you. Look, Federico Novello has posed in his own very own style many perceptions and things that he so eloquently said. He said in neoliberalism we shouldn't necessarily see it as a model, but a program that can politically be self-correcting. It can be variable and manipulable, malleable, and a nemesis or adaptation to the different junctures that make it or prophesize many years still in the future for it to exist. Within this idea that neoliberalism is a program, not a model, which is not in a crisis. It is having serious problems, of course, and the expressions of the seriousness of those problems, we can narrate them as Brexit, as Trump winning presidential elections, and also considerable difficulties for NAFTA to continue among the three partners. And the main is the United States, and it doesn't want to continue this agreement with Mexico, as Carlos Heredia just said. So what we can dare say is that this was what many international relation experts are saying and screaming about, is that multilateralism will start gradually, little by little, being a museum piece, because right now it's rather bilateral relations, hegemonic powers that are directly expressed in each one of the decisions and agreements, and not within the spirit which is ecumenical of international order, in which everyone, through diplomacy and the memory of two very costly world wars, even with social cost, a very high social cost, gave way to the construction of an organization where we can debate almost all the problems. So if the UN at risk as well, if multilateralism is also at risk, then we go into a stage of capitalism, which is now one undoubtedly has won the savage capitalism. Without any doubt, this qualifier identifies the type of capitalism we're now facing. I have a few questions. Let me read some of the questions that I have. Let's see. Evidently, some refer to how to think about these issues we're posing here within the Mexican code, say, the connotation for national junctures. Let me read the first one of many that I have in my hands. It says, will this crisis of neoliberalism, Federico said that this is not a crisis, there's a serious problem with globalization and the very difficult capacity of adaptation of neoliberalism. But the question would be, the crisis of neoliberalism shows an end of the end of history. How is this expressed in Mexico? This crisis of neoliberalism, how is it expressed, and what is to be expected for 2018? Another question here. Let me now give you the floor in a few minutes. We still have to talk about the component of hard sciences in all this scenario or landscape in this very tangential fashion. Susana more than twice spoke about climate change as a very serious problem in which, because of excessive consumption of fossil fuel energy and the removal of forests and the disappearance of sea life, natural carbon reservoirs, we are taking away, we are destroying forests and sea life, and we have greenhouse effect gases because we're consuming fossil fuels. So we do have a combination of the CO2, and this means a film of gases in biosphere that doesn't allow for the exit and the rejection of the rays of the sun. So this is warming up. I mean, we have the global warming and temperatures and the rainfall regimes, all these climate disorders that are associated to economic costs, loss of harvests and floods and the drought phenomenon. So evidently, hard sciences, as the question says, we have to consider those sciences, and I am relating this to climate change, of course. Another question: is there any alternative to neoliberalism that may fight social inequality, and that implies, and what does this model imply? Another reflection for all of us. The person who wrote this question is saying that the world crisis is forcing intellectual youth to look for individualism through brain drain because of the very low social economic incentives in those countries. And another part of youth, they don't want the traditional growth pattern in terms of their own professions and in terms of projects that are well remunerated, do not need higher education studies. And what do you think about the future of youth? This is something that Federico also mentioned at the end of his presentation. Very well. Basically, let's land on these issues regarding the domestic reality, the national reality of Mexico. And someone else here is saying Mexico has economic competitiveness to increase minimum wages and salaries or to stay in NAFTA. This is a question. Can Mexico stay in NAFTA? Does it have the necessary competitiveness? I would like you to comment on the role of other actors or stakeholders in the Latin American region, for instance, Venezuela, to increase tensions between Trump and Mexico. Now, I don't know. In the same order, Rolando, do you agree? Yes, if that's what you want, of course, yes. Well, at a certain point, you told us, there were various requests or proposals of bringing to Mexico all this nefarious landscape we've been mentioning here before the presence of our generous audience this afternoon. I would rather say, however, that knowledge of the world, of the changes in the world and the volumes and atrocities, understanding by this Trump, of course, this doesn't really solve the issue, the fundamental issue we're facing here in Mexico as Mexicans. And I think this is important for us to accept and to start assimilating the situation. However, on the other hand, some of the great topics or issues posed by this crisis, and even before by existing neoliberalism, this is sending the Falklands troops, and this is by Mrs. Thatcher, Mr. Reagan, destroying neighborhoods in Panama. Well, these are issues we shouldn't just take for granted, because then we're alone. I mean, I don't agree with a projection of the difficulties, even if we want to call the crisis of multilateralism, saying that then multilateralism is something of the past. I mean, if multilateralism becomes really something of the past, then the only present and the near future is war, to put it bluntly. This is going to be a world war or bilateral, trilateral war. We don't know. What are we seeing in Europe? What is Europe going through, and also the Middle East? A world war. A world war with the participation of the great powers of the world. This is some brighter, controlled participation. There's a certain principle of values and institutional figures that cannot be seen as finished with impunity. And multilateralism is a case in point. From what I've heard, my reaction would be that we have to defend multilateralism, the existing one, and also push for a new multilateralism that will creatively and productively do what the current multilateralism hasn't been done. For instance, mass migration flows and the very big imbalances among nations. The convergence among the different economies of the world, that at the end of the 20th century it was said that that was the future of humankind. And I don't know. To a great extent, this was a mirage produced by the great specific weight of population in the Chinese economy, because we did have convergence. But in the rest of the world, well, in our case, there was no convergence whatsoever with the United States. Rather, we had divergence. Well, let us forget the idea of convergence, right? Let us pose it differently. Let us address convergences as asymmetries among the peoples, the nations, etc. So another example here. It's been said that neoliberalism cornered the state. And thanks to that, the state, as said today, was captured by great interests, the factual powers, just to give them a name, the multinational companies, which are really those that have really are taking control in this landscape of the breaking down of the international order created in the post-war period. So, as said, this is something we say in Mexico every day. So the state to the dead file or in the garbage can. And without a state, however, there's a war. This is what I think. Without the state, there's civil war. Well, then, what to do in Mexico, knowing that we are part of the situation, with the plus that Carlos Heredia mentioned, that is a neighboring society, which is also our partner, our economic partner, which is collapsing, which is breaking down and changing in a very expedite fashion, not necessary for our well-being or for our own sake. But however, there is a battle among the elites and community states and regional groups. That is, this is not just a day in the park. Mr. Trump cannot just go through the United States with his gang. Wherever he goes, the other side immediately manifests itself. Well, more reason for us to really seriously think about the deep reform of our state, to do it at least to make it solid in terms of the relationship with this neighbor, the future of which is unpredictable, truly. What is predictable, however, is that regardless of the result, this is going to affect us. And there's no other way for us to modulate. I'm not even talking about resolving everything, but modulating this great external or outside impact. If it's not counting with a state which is strong, that I think that in order for it to be strong, it has to be legitimate. To be legitimate, right now, it has to be democratic. But I know this is very elementary, I mean, very basic. So the words we've been mentioning and exchanging here, this is really basic what I'm saying. But let me go back to the major words of our ancestral times. And sometimes they're minor words in our times, in our modern times. I don't think that's the way it is. I do believe, however, that we have to risk a little bit of philosophical conservatism and and discuss, study what it is that humankind has done in this very small part of Mexican humankind. What have we done? This thing called Mexico that is really worth defending, conserving, preserving, and improving and enhancing throughout time. I would say that there's two values, multilateralism. At least in the rhetoric, it was proactive multilateralism that gave way to something that didn't exist. Sometimes we forget this. Before the end of the Second World War, a good part of humankind didn't exist. It was, as Kipling said, the burden of the white man and all the rest, Africans, Asians. As of the end of the Second World War and the construction of the United Nations, and after we coined the idea of human rights and then the human rights for development, that part of humankind, which happened to be the majority, started existing. And it exists thanks to an order that we could sum up to economize on words, proactive multilateralism. It was successful. I don't know what successful means in this type of magnitudes, but it was it really served for something. It was useful for something, of course. So let's give it the right value, because after all, this talks about a story, fantastic story, and also a terrible story, but very short. That is from 1946 to our times. Not many decades, historically speaking, have gone by. So then I insist, and then I will be quiet. Just throwing off board some of these important accomplishments, conquests. Maybe I'm just risking it, calling them conquests, but I think those values, looking at them, this could be very important for a country as unique, as singular. We forget this as well. This is the only underdeveloped countries that has a border with the biggest economy and society of the world, the most developed country of the world. This is the only one. There's no other experience like the Mexico-U.S. experience. And even NAFTA itself, I fully agree with all the critique made here, but even NAFTA has to be seen with thought that's very singular historic element. If not, we're not understanding anything. We're not understanding the position of our fellow men who live in the United States, who do not want to leave the United States, or our fellow men who are coming back from the United States, and the first thing they tell you, look, I just want to go back to the United States. So all that is part of this strange game of geoeconomy and geopolitics, which is part of this history and story. I think we have to deepen more on these issues, especially foreseeing that, in effect, the situation, specifically NAFTA, Trump, and the most general element, multilateralism of all this state and the wars, perhaps they're going to fall on us without even letting us know. Our opinion is not going to be requested. That's for sure. That's my vision. The questions and the excellent interventions of my colleagues here, Susana, Carlos, and Federico. Thank you.
Carlos, Well, it's almost 8, so a final thought. Well, in 140 characters, well, I like 140 more than 280. But here we have 4 economists together and a historian and a sociologist. I'm an internationalist. At the World Bank, there are 5,000 economists. And one of the presidents in the 90s, Jim Wolfenson, was asked, Mr. Wolfenson, what is the most efficient dollar? That is to say, that the money that the bank loans, what is the best investment? And he said, listen, I am going to speak against this 5,000 economists. And he said, first of all, the best investment is such that is going to rise the standard of living of the girls in unfavored regions. And of course, the girls create a family. They're going to become mothers. They need education. They need health care. They need to know that they are worth. And my wife is not an internationalist. She's not an economist. She's a lawyer. And when I shared this with her, she said, I completely agree. Because she organizes this work with indigenous co-ops, and step 1, and you're going to say, what does this have to do with neoliberalism? Well, they create a circle in these workshops, and she asks one of them to give a step forward and asks her to say, I'm a woman, I'm beautiful, and I have the right to be respected. And indigenous women, they just break up. They just start crying. They can't say this. Why? What if my husband notices that I'm doing this? So Wolfingson says, I've seen so many stories like this. And the policies and the economic polity is built upon the backs of women. But it's not giving women the possibility to grow. And the second best investment in terms of its efficiency, and I know that Eduardo Vega would like this, is to invest in clean, accessible water. Why? Because that represents it all. This means health, this means productivity, that means development, quality of life, and you will be shocked to see how many communities in Mexico with no accessible clean water. Therefore, they have intestinal diseases. And so the economy lesson given by Mr. Wolfenson was about let's take care of our women and let's have clean and accessible water. And based on that, of course, there was a rebellion of his economists. Come on, so you are oversimplifying the economy. What's the connection with economic theory? Well, I'm just sharing my experience. And I'm saying this because that in Mexico, we've fallen into the mirage that we need to become a great country, an exporting country, and that's okay. But going back to the basics, going back to what its most fundamental, got lost on the way. And I want to thank Federico Novello for giving us the opportunity to go back to the fundamentals. Thank you, Susana. A final remark before we go? Oh, it's 8 o'clock. Okay, that's good. I think we are living uncertainty. Of course, difficulties are present, and we've discussed some difficulties, but I just want to say that this is a huge opportunity. A huge opportunity to see how can we build a better future for us, but also as part of the world. This question asked, can we be part of NAFTA? With or without NAFTA, the border between Mexico and the U.S. is not going to go away. And there were trade relationships that are going to prevail today, even if it's a formal agreement or not. And at the end of the day, the number of Mexicans and in different generations can be 35 million in the U.S., one-third of the U.S. society. Actually, they're not going to have the same links that we have with Mexican society, so we have to see ourselves differently. We need to see ourselves in a more proactive way by virtue of how are we going to solve locally and globally different challenges. So we cannot accept the fact that half the Mexican territory grows 6-7% and the other half, the southeast, grows 0 or -0. So these are two completely different realities. So I do see that despite difficulties, we need to see ourselves as an opportunity where neoliberalism, well, next year, for example, it's going to be very important, but I would not stay with that short-term view next year. So what do we want as a society? What do we want as a country, as a society? And I agree with what you have said. Let's recover multilateralism and the importance of principles that, yes, it's been criticized extensively, but the fact that there are values in place and that these are guidelines, it is substantial for how we're going to relate with the outside and how we're going to solve the problems within, because we're not alone. And we cannot solve the problems within. So we have to see ourselves as part of the world, but with a completely different view, with an elite in the power that doesn't think that it's white from Alexis de Tocqueville times to the date. And it respects what it's Mexican, and apparently it's blurry, and we need to rethink things. Thank you, Federico.
I wanted to emphasize the issue regarding the programmatic character of neoliberalism with an issue that has just appeared in political options platforms for next year. When it was thought that this great recession will be refounding capitalism, that there would be new regulations, even the fact that then we started seeing by Obama some proposals of economic nationalisms, and the subsidies of France were for the automotive manufacturing in French territory, etc. We had a type of capability to maintain neoliberalism as an agenda. And very fast, people spoke about the banking bailout was a public expense supported on indebtedness, and that was calling for the dangerous idea, or what Basso, another economist, head of the World Bank, has written about as austerity kills. But austerity was called upon. It was just invoked in Mexico as a program, as a political program, economic program, as of 2018. This program is the great capacity of maintaining the same thing at the moment of the Great Recession that seemed to be convening for the refoundation of everything in terms of the reappearance of the state, of the reappearance of regulations, etc., etc. Just think that this austerity is still in effect. What Rolando is saying, I think it's very, very important. When NAFTA was signed, it was thought that there were no countries with greater per capita differences than Mexico and the U.S. And this difference, it has become deeper with NAFTA. It hasn't, the gap hasn't closed, and it was even worse before. There's convergence in the Barrow's logic of having convergence in terms of productivity and having convergence in terms of well-being, and also in terms of the demographic situation. But here, the serious problem is that NAFTA was also thought within the logic of elasticity, income through imports, and the idea that Mexico, by growing 1 percentage point of its GDP, it was going 3 times in exports, and Mexico would be the supplier. But it wasn't the supplier because our great project of an exporting country means that we're exporting a lot of what we import, the so-called temporary importations, and the maquila industry, which is ever dominant in this, plus the salaries. And this issue continues being strategic. Yes, I do believe, like Paul Kennedy says, the United Nations is the parliament of humankind. It demands to have a lot more shared responsibility. The United States has been left there to play a role in whose absence this would be the end of this type of multilateral institutions. But it's a very concrete fact, as also said by Roosevelt, in the face of the International Economic Organization in 1932, to play a relevant role in the world economy, you have to think about the national economy. And this has happened historically, but we have great confusions, and this has to do with ideology. We cannot mistake austerity with Republican austerity of the Juarista period in Mexico. We cannot pose the problem that we do not need a biblical increase in public expenditure to improve the living conditions of Mexicans. We have a lot of state, we need state, strong state, and a lot of public expenditure, which is not only current expenditure. When investments fall in 1982 because of that crisis, public investment, nothing since then has occupied this place. And we have a fall in investment that doesn't allow us to have aspirations as a country. If we continue believing that this space, the budgetary design, may be left in the hands of people who want just to fight inflation, then we do have an agenda to build, a state to be recovered, a lot to imagine, but it is a fact that we are in a critical situation. We are in that situation, not neoliberalism. If we don't understand this in principle, we are done. We continue with this neoliberalist crisis that we think we're in. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Federico, Rolanda, Susana. And in this discussion of what is the crisis that we're facing and what are the connotations and the scope of neoliberalism after the crises that have been identified and discussed here. And I believe that after these four contributions from our colleagues, we see a national agenda that should be indispensable. We Mexicans should not allow the public policy unattends poverty, inequality, unemployment, informal labor, subordination to international affairs, and with that, we would be able to say what our colleagues have shared, refound the Mexican state, redefined national priorities, and in that case, we would be able to discuss how in the globalization stage, in the multilateral stage, by using clear ideas of what the national economy would give to Mexicans. We could have a conversation with anyone, but we could fit in any market, in the most global and open market we want, but only if we have, and we've been knitting this for more than 35 years, an industrial policy. We need a development policy, economic development, social development, and of course, we need social economic development that is sustainable in whatever form it's implemented. And it's 8:12. Thank you very much for staying with us, and I believe that we have contributed to this debate to have a discussion that UNAM is inviting the whole country to join based on this extraordinary proposal, the civilization under siege from wall to wall, and specifically in this panel, what do we think about neoliberalism, the challenges of the nation vis-a-vis this difficult climate? And we're very grateful for your questions. Even when I didn't read all of them, you were able to write and send to us. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias a los doctores Rolando Cordera, Susana Chacón, Carlos Antonio Heredia, Federico Novello, por supuesto, doctor Eduardo Vega, muchísimas gracias. Los esperamos mañana.
We will wait for you tomorrow at 12 to continue this colloquium. We're going to be talking about environmental protection vis-a-vis the anti-scientific discourse with the participation of José Sarucán, Julia Carabias, and Fernando Tudela. This will be at the Miguel Covarrubias auditorium here tomorrow at noon. We will wait for you and hope to see you there. Thank you and good evening.